It is it is wild. It's an unhinged woman style story though. Yeah. Hello, my name is Fraser Simons, and I'm going to do a recent reads for non-eligible Booker books, which I have a little project going on now until the, short long list is announced. So I'll try to make this fairly quick. There's a few books to get through. First is Gold by Rumi. This is a 4-star read for me. I thought it was fantastic. The translation is great to read. It has a little bit of an introduction, introducing a thesis for which I think the book holds a little close to its heart. There are certain aspects that are explained to the reader about what wine, for instance, means to the author, and then you see those things come up in basically every poem. And so the imagery is very repetitive. The musicality is always there though. It's always very fun and interesting, and I read it incrementally, so it didn't ever get annoying for me or anything. But if you're somebody who's coming to this solely for the imagery, you're gonna find that it's extremely repetitive, especially if you do it in one sitting. But otherwise, I thought it was fantastic, so I gave it 4 stars. Next, from NetGalley, I did the audio arc of Sarah Gailey's Just Like Home, of which the person who narrates it is X.E. Sands, so Z Sands, maybe? I'm not sure. And this was fantastic. I gave it 5 stars, which I don't think I've given a Gailey book 5 stars yet. It is a unhinged woman story, so I'd be into it. It is about a woman who is the daughter of somebody who has done something. It seems like maybe he's a killer, a serial killer, helps somebody kill things. It's alluded to that her father is in prison for something really bad, and it haunts her. So when she goes out for interviews, when she gets hired, if she does manage to get hired, generally she ends up losing her job when they find out who she is, stuff like that. So it's something bad, but never directly addressed, at least at the beginning of the story. Of course, you do find out eventually, but it's heavily implied that it's got something to do with murders or something, because she is called home, and her mother is dying and needs somebody to kind of take care of her, but also clean up the house and stuff. And she's assuming that once her mother dies, the house will become hers, possibly. This is complicated though, because there's another person who's working on the property in a shed out back, who's an artist who seems to be glorifying whatever these things happened in the house were, and the actual father, he has formed a relationship with the father in some way, or his father, who was also an artist, did this and wrote a book about what happened. And whereas she has distanced herself from her father, these people have ingratiated themselves, and so the mother is predisposed to liking them a lot more than the daughter. The mother is really cruel, really vicious, and being back at home resurfaces all of these different memories for her. And so we get a sort of dual timeline action where it's not actual dual timeline from what I remember. It's more she is more or less chronologically remembering all the things leading up to the big events that occurred, her upbringing, stuff like that. It is a pretty scary story, or creepy at the very least. She imagines sounds that come from her bedroom all of the time. Memories start coming to the forefront that she hasn't come to grips with. She obviously has a lot of internalized trauma that's going on, and things just completely ramp up and up from there. But I just thought it was really fun, really fantastic. It's creepy in a way that is acceptable to me, in a psychological weird way, where it's alluding to maybe trauma and not something that's physical, but it could be something physical as well. It's very propulsive, very short chapters. It's definitely a genre fiction thriller / horror thing going on. And it could have a supernatural component, but you're not really sure. So you're reading to find out. Yeah, I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. And because it's got Unhinged Women vibes where you're not sure how sane she is, if she's coping with things, she's got internalized trauma, she's not moving through the world, but she is definitely coming home to figure stuff out. Loved it. Next is The Power of the Dog, #1 by Don Winslow, in the Border trilogy, I think is what it's called. Yeah. This book, it's very cinematic. I also gave this 4 stars. I think this is sort of like almost like a modern classic, basically, for crime thrillers. And as you might expect from The Border, it is about a DEA guy who gets embroiled with the war on drugs in Mexico, and it sort of chronicles from like the infancy of that to a few decades later when he's an older guy. Basically, like his entire life is living this job. It does alternate chapters between a priest, a prostitute, and I believe somebody else possibly that I'm missing. But anyway, it's definitely like a polyphonic book. It's very tightly paced, very tightly plotted. It's very cinematic as well, and the writing is quite good, but in a very like utilitarian, parsed back, we're showing the scenes and clipping along, frenetically paced book. Like I think it's 70 chapters or something like that. And so it definitely feels somewhat like some of the characters are caricatures. The ending, I think, subverts some expectations. Again, just like in this genre, you can kind of expect a withholding of catharsis because we know how the war on drugs is going and how it went. And it kind of is showing from the top-down perspective all the way to the granular street level who is sort of at fault for these certain things at a systemic level, implicating absolutely everybody, like every organization, every government, every aspect of the government. Probably there's some details about how this trade went down that you wouldn't really be aware of that is surprising and unsurprising because of the governments, how the narcos ended up owning their government, basically, how the American government and the Canadian government were sort of in on the idea of making a lot of money off of this and sort of looking the other way in certain aspects, but then politically aligning themselves in a very puritanical, very good way, of course. Lots of stuff like that. So if you've seen films like that, it probably won't surprise you, but it's definitely a very good execution of that premise. And if you've seen something like Sicario, it is Sicario. Like, this could be the life of the DEA agent in Sicario before that, like, because he's an older guy, you know, who's been doing it a very long time and very jaded. This, I wouldn't be surprised if the character in Sicario was based on Art, the guy, the main DEA guy in this book. I thought it was great. I will definitely pick up the next one. Lots of trigger warnings, you know. There's some very bad things that are done to children to the point of like even shocking me, like the shock value worked kind of things happen. And if you know stuff about cartels and what they do, maybe you could guess at some of those things, but it's a brutal book. It's about brutality. It's about war in that specific context. Yeah, it's brutal. Next, I read The Promise by Damon Galgut. I've talked about this before because I DNF'd it on paper. This is read by Peter Noble, and I was able to get through it in this, but I still just gave it 3 stars. It really isn't a book for me, mostly because of the perspective that's been crafted. It is about an old woman is dying, someone who is taking care of her is promised the property that the family occupy, as well as I think some land or something like that. And of course, because the only one who is actually a witness to this is both young at the time, and I think the partner of the woman who is dying, he decides to basically put it off until it like never happens, essentially. And the unique perspective why is sort of goes in and out of the heads of all of these different characters, the entire family, and shows them for what they are. So it's very satirical, it's very comedic. It makes fun of them, it makes fun of privilege and class and white people in South Africa, the way that they function, how they perceive things, their entitlement, how they move throughout the world, and absolutely just lambasts them, which I'm here for. But the problem is that I found the narrator super annoying. His actual voice is just, I mean, not the voice actor, but the voice created for this, the perspective of it is just so over the top and so annoying, and I didn't feel like it was actually hard-hitting enough to warrant the page count of it. And it's sort of perfunctory conclusions about the privileged already. Like, if you know anything about white people in South Africa that are fairly privileged and have money, they operate exactly as you would expect. They make the decisions the way that you'd expect. They talk to their servants the way that you would expect. They put off the promise the way that you'd expect. It feels like a very predictable story. The ending is technically, I think the actual plot is quite good, and I think what it is actually doing is good. It just feels like perfunctory basically to me. And had it actually been an enjoyable voice to consume, I would have, been on board with it. Like, it would have been a 4 or a 5-star read instead of a 3-star read, possibly. But it just feels very milquetoast to me. So, next I read Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. This was a fantastic book. I gave it 5 stars. I'm not gonna really go on about it. I have no issues with it. It definitely feels like a quintessential story of the progenitor, and I'm fine with that. I thought it kept me on my toes. I really wasn't sure if or when or why Darcy and Elizabeth would get together, nor the things that happened with the sisters. In some ways it becomes a little bit predictable near the ending, but I thought it is a fantastic character study of all of these people. It was very excellent writing. I had no problems with the writing at all. Just a pleasure just to consume that stuff. It did take me like a day to get used to the style. I didn't realize she was so smart, basically. I started consuming it and I was like, well, this is very a lot for at nighttime when I'm very tired. And then once I woke up the next day, my brain was just on it and loved it. I read it with Shelley from Shelley Swearingen. We did it in increments when she was on vacation. And yeah, we both ended up liking it. And I was riveted, and I think Shelley enjoyed my sort of uptake on it. Because at the very beginning, I believe in the first 50 pages, I was like, this is okay, but probably because I wasn't gelling with the voice completely. And then when I did, I was like, oh, this is excellent, basically. Next, I read Little Fish by Casey Plett on Audible Plus catalog, read by Almeida. I like Dream of a Woman more than this, which makes sense because it would have been an iteration in her craft beyond this one. But yeah, it's about a trans woman who is post-op and is just trying to live her life, even though she passes most of the time. Sometimes she doesn't. She's harangued, harassed. She worries for her safety. She's got a lot of anxiety. She uses alcohol as a coping mechanism. Members of her community sometimes will take their own lives, or just need support structure, just need somebody to support them when they're doing sex work, for instance, and need somebody to, like, someone there for safety and stuff. So it's very harrowing in some ways as well. I thought the characters were well realized. I thought it was very sort of dark, I guess. Like, it's brutal in a lot of ways, but it's about somebody who's just trying to get by and achieve some sort of financial stability, negotiating her different relationships with people that are somewhat unreliable because of the way in which she uses alcohol. And so there's not super that much of a plot. It's more about a slice of life aspect to it. There is kind of a plot that bookends it, but I wouldn't show up for that, basically. There's a funeral and somebody calls the house, and it is implied that her grandparent might have been trans as well. And between that time is the meat of the story, and then near the end of the story she meets the person and there's an interaction, and it's how the outcome of the story and then how well the interaction goes is, I guess, the book ending. But yeah, I gave it 4 stars. Sometimes it's 3 stars in my head, sometimes it's 4 stars in my head. It's definitely worth reading. I thought it was not as well realized as Dream of a Woman, though. And next, I read Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. This is another Audible Plus catalog thing, narrated by Duncan Steen. I gave this 2 stars. Where do I even start with this? Basically, it's interesting to see the progenitor of a self-help book. All of the rules that he makes, Jordan Peterson, hello, are basically ranging from like the most basic self-help advice that you get with some decent prose to treat your slave nice kind of stuff, where it's so antiquated that you're like, okay, whatever. But because it's tied to a massively privileged person in society, and it wasn't even, I believe, written for consumption of the masses anyway, it is his own sort of circular logic about things in which he would apply these notions when trying to come to a decision, right? And so, as you can tell, it's circuitous, I hope intentionally, because if not, it's kind of not deft about it. It reiterates many points often, and it is very much predicated on the puritanical notions of some people being elevated by the gods and nature, slash treat your slaves good, right? There's a lot of logical fallacies that are implied in it. Some of them are very explicit. If somebody is writing, he did the bulk of this writing when he was engaged in a military campaign. He was the emperor of a country. He has puritanical beliefs. He wants to honor the gods. He owns slaves. There's a lot of different reasons why you would not specifically read this in order to apply these notions to your life, right? Some of them definitely are relatable, and the sociological aspects are compelling in some ways, but less so do they come up. Like, you'd be surprised how much it is about things that are not sociological when it is ostensibly supposed to be applied to primarily sociological means. So I don't know, I thought it was not that well executed. In terms of relevancy, I could see why people like it. I think that it is so absorbed by popular culture that every self-help book, you could get these same notions without having to listen to a guy who is not morally just. And I think, it's kind of interesting to see a Stoic apply rationality for unjust things anyway, even though he does say, in all fairness, that his thinking should be updated as somebody goes throughout their life. And so ostensibly, as things came to light, maybe the pattern of Stoic thinking would be different. But you definitely see online dudes applying this rhetoric when they're fighting with people like, I am the logical Spock guy, and because you are angry, your point is invalid. Shit like that, right? So, yeah. Next, I read Killer in King's Cove, Lane Winslow #1 by Iona Wishaw, and read by Marilla Wex. This is a murder mystery set in Canada. It's a historical fiction and is set in BC. She is a retired MI6 agent that comes to Canada to just be peaceful, get out of things. Somebody has ostensibly died, as those spies tend to do, and she just wants to get away from it all. It's more about sort of slice of life and about the specific characters in the region until, of course, a murder happens. Somebody tries to pin it on her. I found it exceptionally contrived. I didn't like the dialogue very much. The characters weren't that interesting to me when applied to the mystery. Themselves, standalone, were completely fine. But as they relate to the mystery, it definitely feels like I am setting up the town and all of these people, some of whom are pertinent, some are not, which is just not my favorite. And then the contrivances of this person who's trying to pin it on them didn't work for me, basically. I found it kind of inane. So I wouldn't recommend it. I finished it though. I gave it 2 stars. Wouldn't continue, basically. Another Audible Plus catalog, one that was expiring that I was just trying to get through. And that's it. That's my recent reads. If you read any of these, feel free, and I encourage you to tell me about it in the comments. Engage with me however you like, about whatever you like, and I will see you next video. Bye.